Welcome to exercise 8. First, I would like to start by giving thanks to Paul and to Adam for inviting me to this wonderful conference. And I also just want to say that this is a series of 4 walks that I took through Via Grimaldi, which is one of the most important center for detention and torture and disappearance in Chile. My name is Diana Taylor, and I'm a professor of performance studies at New York University. And so there's a little bit of performance in here. The other thing to say is there's 4 walks, but it's just like theater in that if you can survive the first act, you will survive it all, because the first walk is much longer than the ones that follow. Okay, so don't think they're all going to be that long. Okay.
Aquí vamos a hacer un memorial, aquí vamos a hacer un lugar donde se presente música, vamos a hacer algo cultural, vamos. Pero yo pensaba, se haga lo que se haga, no, nunca se van a poder borrar ni tampoco enterrar los escombros de tantas vidas, porque quedamos hechos escombros.
This is Teresa Nativi, a survivor from Villa Grimaldi, but I'm going to talk about her a little bit later. Pedro Mata is a survivor who gives guided tours to people who want to know what happened in Villa Grimaldi. Given my work on disappearances in Argentina, which is where I started all this, colleagues thought I would like to meet him. He greets me and hands me the English version of a book he has written, A Walk Through a 20th Century Torture Center, Villa Grimaldi, A Visitor's Guide. I tell him I'm from Mexico and speak Spanish. Ah, he says, his eyes narrowing as he scans me. Taylor, I just assumed. The space is expansive. It looks like a ruin or a construction site with old rubble and signs of new building. A transitional space, part past, part future. I look down at the book Mata gave me and at the map he created that I showed you first, and that outlines the route of the visit. A crude, handmade sign at the entrance, Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi, informs visitors that 4,500 people were tortured here and 226 people were disappeared and killed between 1973 and 1979. This place is simultaneously a torture camp, a memory site, and a peace park. Like many memory sites, it reminds us that this tragic history belongs to all of us and asks us to behave respectfully so that it might remain and continue to instruct. Lesson 1, clearly, is that this place is our responsibility in more ways than one. But how does it belong to us? And who is the us being invoked and created by the sign? This way, please. Mata walks me over to the small model of the torture camp to help me visualize the architectural arrangement of a place now gone. Cuartel Terra Nova. Terra Nova, or new land, used to designate unexplored territories on ancient maps, and this site indeed remains unexplored. Who knew the Chilean military was so interested in ancient scholarship? The mock-up is laid out like a coffin under a plastic, slightly opaque sunshade that in itself distorts vision. As in many historically important sites, the model offers a bird's-eye view of the entire area. The difference here is that what I see in the model is no longer here. Even though I am present, I will not experience it in person. So, one might ask, what is the purpose of the visit? What can I understand by being physically in a torture center once the indicators have disappeared? Little besides the sign at the entrance reveals any context. My photographs might illustrate what the place is now, not what it was. So why? It's enough for me for now that I'm here in person with Mata, who takes me through the recorrido or walkthrough. Mata speaks in Spanish. It makes a difference. He seems to relax a little, though his voice is very strained and he clears his voice often. Maybe the words resist being conjured up. Maybe his stiff body belies current attempts to put the past behind him. For Mata, it's not just about what happened in the historical sense, but also about the ways in which his experience of Villa Grimaldi carries into the present. The compound, originally a beautiful 19th century villa, used for get-together for artists and intellectuals, was taken over by DINA, Augusto Pinochet's special forces, to interrogate the people detained by the military during the massive roundups. Many important artists, thinkers, and activists were disappeared and tortured. As thousands of people were captured, many civilian spaces were identified with progressive intellectuals and left-wing movements were transformed into makeshift detention centers. Taking their spaces seemed as necessary as taking their lives. Villa Grimaldi is only one of the most famous spaces. One of the attractions for the military, I learned later, was that the remote site was close to an airport controlled by Pinochet, head of the armed forces. This was convenient for loading drugged or dead prisoners on death flights and dumping them into the sea. In the late 1980s, one of the generals sold Villa Grimaldi to a construction company belonging to the Pinochet family to tear down and replace with a housing project. Survivors and human rights activists could not stop the demolition, but after much heated debate, they did secure the space as a memory site and peace park in 1995. Mata, among other survivors and human rights activists, has spent a great deal of time, money, and energy to make sure that the space remains a permanent reminder of what Pinochet did to its people. 3 epochs, 3 histories overlap in this space that even now has multiple functions: evidentiary, commemorative, reconciliatory, and pedagogical. The miniature detention camp positions us as spectators. We stand above the handmade model, looking down at its organizational structure. The main entrance to the top left allowed for vehicles delivering hooded captives to drive up to the main building. Mata's language and my imagination populate the inert space. He points to the tiny copy of the large main building that served as a center for operations for DINA. Here the military planned who they would target and evaluate the results of their torture sessions. The officer in charge of Villa Grimaldi and his assistants had offices there, and there was a mess hall for officers. The space housed the shortwave radio station that kept the military personnel in contact with their counterparts throughout South America. Plan Condor, the transnational network of the regressive military regimes operating in Latin America, in cooperation with Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State, and the CIA. And they shared intelligence and helped persecute progressive leaders and militants on the run. And Plan Condor covered all over the Americas. Some people say it came to Greece. I'm not sure. We'll have to find out. In the small buildings along the perimeter to the left, the prisoners were divided up, separated, and blindfolded. Men here, women there. Miniature drawings made by the survivors lined the periphery. Hooded prisoners pushed by the guards and rifles for their 30 seconds at the latrines. A hall of small locked cells guarded by an armed man. A close-up drawing of the inside of one of the cells in which a half dozen shackled and hooded men are squeezed in tightly. An empty torture chamber with bare metal bunks equipped with leather straps. A chair with straps for arms and feet. A table with instruments. An image of the torturers. Is there one more? No, I'm sorry. Torture is very literal. Breaking bodies becomes a way of breaking resistance, breaking workers' unions, and student movements. The fractures in society become the fractures on the body. The images show how literally, too, the objects reference behaviors. I know exactly what happened there or here. Mata points to the model. It's clear that the displacement offered by the model gives him a sense of control. He no longer needs to fully relive the image to describe it. He can externalize it and point to it over there. The violence, in part, can be transferred to the archive, materialized in the small evidentiary mock-up. He is explicit about the criminal politics and very clear in his condemnation of the CIA's role in the Chilean crisis. His blue eyes pierce me, and then he remembers, I'm not that audience. An audience, but not that audience. Looking down at the model in relationship to the larger space, I see we are standing on the site of the main building, usurping the military's place. Looking offers me the strange fantasy of seeing or grasping the whole, the fiction that I can understand systemic criminal violence, even as I position myself simultaneously in and above the conflict. I am permitted to identify without identifying. I am not implicated except to the degree that I can understand the information transmitted to me by the mock-up and Mata, my guide. This happened there, back then, to them. Recounting performs the spatial and temporal displacement. The encounter at this point is about representation and explication of facts. I take photographs, wondering how the tenuous evidentiary power of the photograph might extend the fragile evidentiary claim of the model camp. I know what happened at Via Grimaldi, of course, but I wonder if being there helps me know it differently. Can I, being there with my camera, do anything to further make visible this criminal violence? The other violence, the economic policies that justified and enabled the breaking of bodies, the annihilations of rights and aspirations of liberty, remains fully operational today, but safely outside the frame of my camera. We look up and around at the place itself. There's not much to see of the former camp. The remains of a few original structures and replicas of isolation cells and a tower dot the compound, emptied, though not empty of something palpable in its absence. There's no history, no one's responsible. Activists planted a row of birch trees. These, I learned later, to symbolize the fragile and solitary condition of the ex-prisoners, along with their resistance. With the camp demolished, Mata informs and points out, but he does not seem to connect personally or emotionally to what he describes. Some objects have been reconstructed and placed to support the narration. A model of Casas Chile, 1 meter by 2 meters, forced 4 or 5 prisoners to stand upright for extended periods of time. They were called that by the armed forces as an ironic put-down of Salvador Allende's initiative to provide the poor with housing, small and cramped though it was. Mata told me later he had learned to sleep standing up in one of those cells. Mata walks towards the original entryway, the massive iron gate, now permanently locked and sealed, as if to shut out the possibility of further violence. From this vantage point, it is clear that another layer has been added to the space. A wash of decorative tiles, chips of the original ceramic found at the site, form a huge arrow-like shape on the ground, pointing away from the gate towards the new peace fountain, symbol of life and hope, and a large performance pavilion. The architecture participates in the rehabilitation of the site. The cross layout moves from the criminal past to the redemptive future. Mata ignores that for the moment. He is not in the Peace Park. This is not the time for reconciliation. Mata speaks impersonally in the third person about the role of torture. 500,000 people were tortured and 5,000 killed out of a population of 8 million. I do the math. That's 1 in 16. There were more tortures and fewer murders in Chile than in neighboring Argentina, where the armed forces permanently disappeared 30,000 of their own people. Pinochet chose to break rather than eliminate his enemies. The population of ghosts, or individuals destroyed by torture, thrown back into society, would be a warning to others. Mata speaks about the development of torture as a tool of the state, from its early experimental phase to the highly precise and tested practice it became. Mata's tone is controlled and reserved. He is giving information, not personal testimony, as he outlines the daily workings of the camp, the transformation of language and words that were outlawed. Crímenes, desaparecidos, and dictadura, crimes, disappeared, and dictatorship were replaced by excesos, presuntos, and gobierno militar. Excesses, presumed, missing, and military government. As we walk, he describes what happened where, and I noticed that he keeps his eyes on the ground, a habit born of peering down from under the blindfold he was forced to wear. The shift is gradual. He begins to reenact ever so subtly as he retells. He moves deeper into the death camp. Here, pointing at an empty spot, he says, usually unconscious, the victim was taken off the parrilla, or the metal bed, and if male, dragged here. Looking down, I see the shards of cement, of ceramic tiles and stones that now mark the places where buildings once stood, and the paths where victims were pushed to the torture centers. As I follow, I too know my way by keeping my eyes on the ground. Sala de tortura, one says, which is torture chamber, or celdas para mujeres detenidas, cell for detained women. I follow his movement, but also his voice that draws me in. Gradually, his pronouns change. They tortured them became they tortured us. He brings me in closer. His performance animates the space and keeps it alive. His body connects me to what Pinochet wanted to disappear, not just the place, but the trauma. Mata's presence performs the claim, embodies it, le da cuerpo. He has survived to tell. Being in place with him communicates a very different sense of the crimes than looking down on the model. Walking through Via Grimaldi with Mata brings the past up close. Past is actually not past. Now, here, and in many parts of the world as we speak. I too am part of this scenario now. I have accompanied him here. My eyes look straight down, mimetically rather than reflectively, looking through his downturned eyes. I do not really see, I imagine. I presenciar, I presence, an active verb. Embodied cognition, neuroscientists call this, but we in theater have always thought of it as mimesis and empathy. We learn and absorb by mirroring other people. I participate not in the events, but in his transmission of the affect emanating from the events. My presencing offers me no sense of control, no fiction of understanding. When he gets to one of the original trees used to torture prisoners in various ingenious ways, he acts out some of the positions that he and others endured. He suffered a permanent lesion in his shoulder, he told me, and his heart was affected. In front of where the torture room stood, he relates that the tortured body begins to release water from all its pores. Although completely dehydrated, the person cannot drink water because of the remaining electricity in the body would electrocute him or her. It takes a few hours to de-electrify. And electricity, he continues, makes the body contract, so the torturers would strap the victim down with a leather strap. Prisoners were left with lasting damage to their spinal column and often their sphincter. When he gets to the memorial wall marked with the names of the dead, built 20 years after the events, he breaks down and cries. He cries for those who died, but also for those who survived. Torture, he says, destroys the human being, and I am no exception. I was destroyed through torture. This is the climax of the tour. The past and present come together in this admission. Torture works into the future, and yet it forecloses the very possibility of future. The torture site is transitional, but torture itself is transformative. It turns societies into terrifying places and people into zombies. Now, post-1990 in Chile, nothing is the same. When Mata leaves the memorial wall, his tone shifts again. He's moved out of the death space. Now he is more personal and informal. We talk about how other survivors have dealt with trauma, about similarities and differences with other torture centers and concentration camps, both in Chile and in other parts of the world. He says he needs to come back. The walkthrough reconnects him with his friends who were disappeared. Whenever he visits with a group who is interested, he feels he is doing what he wishes one of his friends had done for him, had he been the one disappeared. Afterwards, he goes home, physically and emotionally drained, he says, and drinks a liter of fruit juice and goes to sleep. He doesn't get up until the following morning. His body still hurts from the torture, and he has developed debilitating side effects. We continue to walk past the replica of the water tower where the high-value prisoners were isolated, past the Sala de Memoria, or memory room, one of the few remaining original buildings that served as the photo and silkscreen rooms. At the pool, also original, he tells one of the most chilling accounts told to him by a collaborator. Different commemorative art and memorials for the dead have been installed, some by political parties, the ones most virulently hit by the junta, the Chilean Communist Party, for example, and the MIR, the Revolutionary Left Movement. And there's this periphery of small grave sites. Near the exit, a large sign with the name of the dead reminds us that el olvido está lleno de memoria. Forgetting is full of memory. And of course, the ever hopeful nunca más. So, this is a reflection on part one. After my first visit to Villa Grimaldi with Pedro Mata, a friend told me he does the same visit the same way every time. Stands in the same spot, recounts the same events, cries at the memorial wall. Some commentators find this odd, as if the routine makes the emotion suspect. Are the tears for real? Every time? Is Mata a professional trauma survivor? The reenactments, I believe, are central both to trauma and to performance. Trauma, like performance, is known by the nature of its repeats, never for the first time. We speak of trauma only when the event cannot be processed and produces the characteristic aftershocks. Trauma, like performance, is always experienced in the present, here and now. For a survivor of torture, going back to the torture camp is a deliberate re-entry into a painful memory path. Memory, as we know, is linked to place. one clear reason why that place needs not only to exist, but to be marked for the violence to be acknowledged. These tours, then, give him a way of keeping his past alive, yet under control. For Mata, both the victim and the witness, trauma, like his activism, is a durational performance. His experience does not last 2 hours. It has lasted years, since he was disappeared by the armed forces. His reiterated acts of leading people down the paths characterize trauma and trauma-driven actions to channel and alleviate. I can understand what Mata is doing here better than I can understand what I am doing here. I wonder about aura, and I worry about voyeurism and dark tourism. What does Mata's performance want of me as an audience or as a witness? What does it mean about witnessing and the quality of being in place? He needs others to acknowledge what happened there and to demand justice. Witness, a transitive verb, defines both the act and the person carrying it out. The verb precedes the noun. It is through the act of witnessing that we become a witness. Identity relies on the action. We are both the subject and the product of our acts. Mata is the witness for those who can no longer tell. He is the witness to himself as he tells his own ordeal. He is a witness in the juridical sense, having brought charges against the Pinochet dictatorship. He is also the object of my witnessing. He needs me to acknowledge what he and others went through in Via Grimaldi. The transitivity of witness ties us together. That's one reason he's so keen to gauge the nature of his audience. Trauma-driven activism, like trauma itself, cannot simply be told or known. It needs to be enacted, repeated, and externalized through embodied practice. In our everyday lives, we have no way of dealing with violent acts that shatter the limits of our understanding. We all live in proximity to criminal violence, and though some of us have felt it more personally than others, this violence is never just personal. This is the strength and weakness of this kind of memorialization. It's so personalized and concentrated that it tends to focus just on the designated victims in space. But if we focus only on the personal trauma, we risk evacuating the politics. Standing there together, bringing the buildings and routines back to life, we bear witness not only to just the personal loss, but to a system of power relations, hierarchies, and values that not only allowed but required the destruction of others. That's the end of my first visit. Oh, I didn't show you this one. Oh, no, yes I did. I'm just going backwards. Okay, so this was Pedro Mata's feet. Okay, contested spaces. So this is 2012. I heard that the renovations on Via Grimaldi had been completed under President Michelle Bachelet's government, herself a victim of detention and torture in Via Grimaldi. Her father, a general, was killed by Pinochet's forces. The space had been renovated and outfitted with an education and resource center. An audio tour was available in several languages. Clearly, it was time to go back, this time without a survivor, to try to understand how presence and voice affected my understanding of the space. The outside looked very different. More institutional, though understated. Inside, the homemade sign at the gate reminding me to behave is gone. A plinth now mapped out the timeline. There's no reference to any us or any shared responsibility. Who is the intended audience or visitor of this renovated space? Via Grimaldi, I sensed, had been incorporated into the international memory site industry. So yet another layer had been added to the site. I picked up the headphones and transmitter from a young woman at the new resource center and chose the tour in Spanish. As before, there was no one in the park. Why, I wondered. This, too, I sensed was a historical question. I asked the person if in the resource center if I may be allowed to look in the new buildings. She said there was no one there to show me, but sensing my disappointment, she handed me the keys and asked me to lock up and bring them back to her after I finished. Even without the sign asking me to behave, the keys on the heart-shaped ring made me feel very responsible. I put on the headphones and started my walk. The quiet, rhythmic voice of the unidentified female guide, I found out later, belonged to a well-known actress of Chilean telenovelas, or soap operas. But without knowing that, I assumed that the young, fresh voice had been untouched by the violence she was describing. The instructions were clear from the outset. I was to move to the different points on the audio tour marked on the Xerox map. The recorrido followed the same route taken by Mata, but the handmade model was gone, replicated by a new, glossy, machine-made replica.
Track 2. Model. At the end of the past century, Emilio Vasallo purchased this property, turning it into a restaurant, which he called Paraíso Villa Grimaldi, as it reminded him of an Italian villa.
Sorry. So look at this. Everything was brittle and white, as in a deep freeze. Everything in white was gone. The remaining structures, whatever's still left there, is dark. I recognized the buildings, but not the feeling. The model had been drained of color, drained of its handmade quality, its human history. It was a different kind of emptying than I had felt the first time. The brutality of the demolition had been replaced by the negation of life itself. I moved to the locked iron gate, but now, on my own, I stopped to peer out of the aperture. Now the designated stops were marked by plaques with audio numbers, and the new tile markers enacted both the mandate to fix in place and update. There were some new buildings locked. I find the key and let myself in. The cases exhibit pieces of metal that the military had attached to the bodies that they threw into the ocean so that they wouldn't float up. The button, you can see it there in the magnifying glass, accentuated by the magnifying glass, offers proof, if any is still needed, of what happened to the bodies. Now the site is much more ordered. The paths are clearly marked and illuminated. Some of the beauty of the 19th century villa had been restored with wading pools and multiple fountains. The site had been integrated visually and politically into the surrounding neighborhood. The neighboring houses were now visible. Their view of the park must be quite pleasant. The torture sign had been domesticated. The visceral pain I felt with Mata has given place to repose. This clearly transmits the sense of a different political moment. With the opening of the new Museum of Memory and Human Rights that same year, it appears that the contestation has given way to a time of acceptation and memorialization. Later, as I peer behind the buildings, I see all the original handmade materials in a heap, under tarps, in a shed. So here's the model. Here are the ceramic tiles. And there are the names of the dead. The names of the dead have bled on the sign, reminding us that forgetting is full of memory, and memory clearly is also full of forgetting. I feel very alone as I continue the walkthrough, and as before wonder what I'm doing here. If Mata needed me to presenciar and acompañar, I realize how much I needed him to experience Villa Grimaldi. I fumble with the buttons on the digital recorder and feel silly with the headphones, even though the site is empty. I get impatient as the voice tells me, in that matter-of-fact way that you heard, about the political acts that led to the creation of this torture center. The details, the names of the generals, organizations, and so on overwhelm me. I feel face-to-face with history, but I miss the human scale. I feel tempted to pull the headphones off, but resist temptation. When the audio segment comes to an end, I stop, search the map for the next step, and move towards it. The same bland tone speaks of unimaginable brutality, describes the voice of a woman captain with a voice like Edith Piaf, who sang to drown out the screams of the torture. Even when the voice cites specific testimony, there's no change in tone. As I walk, the voice points out the rose garden where the torturers would take the women to rape them. Now there are roses honoring the women with their names on them. Another way to individualize terror. I take in the facts, but I find it hard to relate to the events and to the space. The voice does not speak to me, and I find the disconnect between the tone and the tale troubling. It's as if we could separate out the different moments, routines, and spaces. The pauses between the segment, too, seem very different from Mata's recounting. His silences were full of memory. His face, his body, and mood transmitted his thinking process and affective swings. I cannot identify the silences of the audio. They were simply blank, nothing, not even tape. If forgetting and silence are full of memory, full of life, the audio has a hard time capturing that life. I felt beautiful but not engaged as I followed the voice around Via Grimaldi. It was a pedagogical experience, a physical exercise in never again. What does this tour ask of me? The voice thanks me for my visit. It explains that Via Grimaldi is a material and symbolic trace of state terrorism under Augusto Pinochet. The explanation clearly lays out the criminal practice linked to the neoliberal economic policies. It says that the visit is a look at the past. Still, we hope, says the unidentified voice, that it prompts reflection on the present and an impetus to halt human rights abuses throughout the world. If I am interested in knowing more, then please visit the website, etc. She also gives me the phone number. I take the headphones back to the office and ask the woman at the desk about the narration of the audio. She thought they had chosen a young actress with no direct ties to the violent past because they wanted the younger generation to identify. Via Grimaldi, then, is no longer about Mata and trauma and justice deferred. It's about getting the next generation to understand their history. This, then, is a very different future. Memory has been actualized, and now the battle lines have been drawn differently. But it's interesting because the right-wing government of Sebastián Piñera, who became president of Chile in 2010, had taken away funding both from Via Grimaldi and the Museum of Memory. So it was a doubt whether they would continue operating, and so the struggle had shifted again. So these are still contested spaces, contested presence, and contested pasts. So the third section, see, I told you they get shorter. This is not the place. I once again returned to Via Grimaldi, this time with Teresa Nativia, a very close friend whose voice you heard at the beginning, who had been detained and tortured here. She could speak far more directly to things that women had experienced there. She told me about the first time she and other survivors had returned to the space after it had been reclaimed. They all met, about 150 of them, she recalls, outside the metal gate that had been opened for the last time. The survivors hugged and wept in silence. She recalls that everyone shut their eyes as they embraced their fellow survivors. They had never seen each other before. They had never heard each other's voices. She says the silence at the reunion of the blind who had been brought together and had never seen each other. They started to look around the space, covered with brambles and barbed wire, and recognized nothing. She says, we looked for those places and we couldn't find them. I know we will never find them. So this is the gate that has been locked forever. So when I went to Via Grimaldi with her, I asked her if it upset her to go back. She said, no, this is not the place. But then she added, but my bones hurt. The redesigned space, landscaped gardens, roses, beautiful trees, water pools, and the pavilion had little to do with the place in which she had been tortured, violated, and denied her humanity. That place remains in her. She carries it everywhere. Like Mata, she lost an enormous amount in that place. A tortured woman lost the twins she was carrying. Teresa and Pedro Mata both admitted to losing not only friends, but part of their own humanity, their ability to trust others. Their bodies changed, and they carry the pains and fractures induced by torture into their older age. The loss and grief that accompany disappearance and torture belong to the realm of invalidated grief. No one has been brought to trial. How can one grieve under these circumstances? While those killed in Via Grimaldi are named in the rosters of victims on the current Via Grimaldi website and carved into the memorial wall, survivors have no place. In the 1991 Rittig report, issued after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, listed only the cases of those disappeared and murdered by the Pinochet regime. The Valek report, issued by the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Tortured in 2004 and 5, finally acknowledged those who had been tortured and detained, as well as the children of the disappeared. The Chilean state used that list to make reparations to survivors, but the names and circumstances have been locked away for 50 years. Torture and disappearance, we know, continues to affect the victims and their families and the society for generations. Places like Parque de la Paz, Villa Grimaldi remind us of what happened within those walls, but they also transcend the pain and the violence in search of peace and reconciliation. The park performs a restorative, world-making gesture, but it can never be the place of the terror, the center of unmaking of so many worlds of the people who died passing through. I cannot capture that place with my camera. Mata cannot conjure it for others to see. Teresa Nativia does not recognize it. But being in the park with them, I sense the power of place. I feel the pain they associate with it, and I accompany them for a little while on their very long journey towards justice, acceptance, and renewal. This is the last part. Our Mobilizing Memory Working Group for the Hemispheric Institute Encuentro this year in July decided to go to Villa Grimaldi, and I asked Pedro Mata to walk us through. After a back and forth on how much we would pay him, he agreed to meet all 35 of us at the gate. Teresa and Nativia joined us. The question again was, what language would we speak? The group decided he should speak in Spanish, and I would translate into English. Again, we started at the model, the explanation of how Cuartel Terranova had worked, and then we began to walk around the villa. At first, the translation was easy. Mata transmitted facts, and so did I. This happened back then to them, all distant, all third person. We walked to the locked entry gate and then the first torture chambers. Gradually, as before, Mata's pronouns slipped. They tortured them, became they tortured us. The words gnawed into me. They tortured us, I had to say. They strapped me down here, put electrodes to my genitals, to my temples, in all my orifices. My body arched with shock. I sweat so much, I was at risk of electrocuting myself. As I said these words, my body began unconsciously to take on Mata's gestures and movements. His pauses became my pauses. My body became the medium. It happened gradually, imperceptibly. The further we got into the past that was not past, the torture that had never stopped or gone away, I lost my distance. I followed him there again to that place. I accompanied him, my voice an echo of his. Against my wishes, I began to embody the pain. I felt the words violating my body, my resentment growing even as I said the words. Why me? I started thinking. Why don't these people learn Spanish? He kept telling his story in a low, undramatic way. He used no adjectives. I realize now that the words I realize now that those words were in my mouth. My senses locked down, focusing only on what he was relating. Translating became interpreting, and then inhabiting, identifying with him and what he was recounting. I didn't want to be there. But maybe I was also channeling his feelings of not wanting to be there either. Anger became my distancing device. At the end of the trajectory, I handed Mata the money, promised myself I would never come back again. He might be a professional survivor, but I am not a professional observer. And yet, of course, I am. And my little postscript is the questions posed by these dark sites extend far beyond the fences built around them. The small model near the entrance is to Via Grimaldi what Via Grimaldi is to Chile and what Chile is to the rest of the Americas, a miniature rendition of a much larger project. There were 800 torture centers in Chile under Pinochet. If so many civic and public places like villas and gyms and department stores and schools were used for criminal violence, how do we know that the whole city did not function as a clandestine torture center? We might control a site and put a fence around it, but the city, the country, the southern cone, the hemisphere has been networked for violence. We have to think of Guatemala, where all of this started in 1954. The first time that the word disappearance enters our political lexicon was in Guatemala, with, of course, the United States. Then Brazil, 64, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia. But one of the things I just want to leave us with is that this situation is not between dictatorships and democracies. That is a false distinction. So disappearance as state policy exceeds the division between the dictatorship and democracy. It's all about neoliberalism. Because the reason that torture became necessary in Argentina and in Chile and in all these other places was because the military juntas had been instructed to open up the markets for neoliberalism. And so they had to break the unions, they had to break the students. So Mexico, for example, a democratic country for a long time, now leads in the systemic practice of state-sanctioned torture, disappearance, and murder in the Americas. I think in the last 6 years, we've had something like 250,000 people killed. So I'm sorry to leave you with that unhappy thought, but I just think it's important not to think of these sites as somehow contained and as somehow different from what's happening. I think they, in fact, are only tiny little indications of much, much broader political economic practice. Thank you very much.